Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, as you know, during these History Hangouts, we like to bring you some of the terrific work being done by folks who have received support from the Hagley Center in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds. One such scholar joins me today. Daniel Wortel-London is visiting assistant professor at Bard College, and we're here to discuss his new book, The Menace of Prosperity: New York City and the Struggle for Economic Development, 1865 to 1981. Daniel, thanks for speaking with me today.
It's great to see you again, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Oh, likewise. Let's start by sort of painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it your book is about?
My book is about debates over New York City's economic growth between the first Gilded Age, which, if you want to think of our era as the second, and the 1970s. So, looking at the way different groups consider the costs of different economic development strategies and what alternatives they proposed, and the consequences of these debates over New York City's and America's politics.
Hmm. Who are some of the key actors in your story here?
Well, we could go back to Henry George and activists who were proposing land value taxation as one remedy for the city's fiscal woes. Then Jane Jacobs in the 1960s and thinking about how a more diverse local economy could help the city achieve both prosperity and justice for its citizens.
Hmm. Do those perspectives sort of bookend your study then?
I would say so. I think the story really ends after New York's fiscal crisis when I argue that the range of alternatives for addressing New York's economic woes somewhat narrows. And in fact, the whole story really is a tale of three fiscal crises going from the 1870s to the 1930s to the 1970s. And after each of these crises, different generations of New Yorkers proposed remedies. And by looking over time, we can see how the range of these remedies changes, narrows, and leads to what comes after.
Hmm. Why have you called it the menace of prosperity?
Well, we sort of assume that growth pays for itself and that prosperity is sort of a neutral process or just a positive good. But there can be costs of different growth strategies, and those costs can be visible in the form of pollution, but they could also be invisible in the form of, let's say, public subsidies for private growth that don't pan out. So a lot of my book is about how different groups perceive the costs of economic growth and how they try to develop alternatives. And the title actually comes from Lewis Mumford, who talks about how New York's effort to create very high land values in New York in the 1930s made it more difficult to erect factories in the city, to erect public housing in the city. And so what seemed like a prosperous city with very high land values actually had a lot of costs down the line. So that's sort of the framework, thinking that economic growth doesn't always lead to general prosperity or economic development in a real sense.
Hmm. Can we take it in three parts? Sort of the first, the 1870s crisis, and then its solution, and then the unintended consequences thereof, and sort of unpack each of the three
Mhm.
in that fashion?
Sure. Yeah, so in the 1870s, one out of every five American cities were bankrupt. It was the aftermath of the 1873 Depression, and a lot of cities were in trouble because they had gone into debt the previous decade to promote things like parks and public improvements and basically promote their real estate. And figures like Henry George argued that actually cities were going bankrupt because there were by trying to promote real estate value growth and increase their tax revenue, they were making land uh, unavailable because it was so high in cost. It was making it unavailable to erect factories there, to build homes, and it was siphoning money into the hands of speculators rather than to people who were in the real productive economy. So he and a lot of other working class activists argued that if we lower land values, partly through the land value tax, we'd make cities more available for productive enterprise. And this was joined by advocates of municipal ownership who were arguing that the city was contracting out so many services like transportation and utilities to private monopolists. And these monopolists overcharging citizens, the service was bad, and they were demanding exorbitant subsidies from the city. So these municipal ownership advocates said if we can get the city into business, into profitable business, it could raise revenue without even needing to put as high a tax on property owners. So municipal ownership was an economic strategy for a lot of these activists after the 1870s. But it was these strategies were ultimately not carried out to their fullest, partly because many progressive reformers in the early 1900s were wary of getting the city into business, and they preferred to rely on the private sector to spearhead economic development. And they would use public subsidies to promote those actors, but they hoped they could use regulations and other incentives to make sure these actors were responsible. And that's where you get zoning laws. That's where you get these kind of public commissions, regulatory commissions, and these more technocratic modes of economic governance. You see this in New York with the Board of Estimates. You see this with some of its debt policies, which are very off limits to democratic oversight. So by going in this sort of technocratic dimension and getting lucky with some of their investments, like the subway, liberals were able to prevent some of these more radical strategies from taking root. Uh, so, by the end of the World War I, New York was sort of back to its boosterism phase, though with a little bit more regulation behind it.
And then how is that panning out by the time we reach the 1930s and the Great Depression?
So during the 20s, the city was again promoting real estate growth. In the outer boroughs, it was promoting suburbanization by building out infrastructure and subsidizing small homeowners with tax exemptions. Those homeowners who wanted more improvements often for their neighborhoods, those improvements would be financed by taxing the central city. And the central city of downtown Manhattan or Brooklyn then promoted there was skyscraper development in those areas as more taxes fell on them, and landlords converted their properties to what they thought of as higher and better uses. So the city was growing upward and outward during the 20s under the assumption that there was unlimited demand for growth. And the city was in debt. Banks were loaning it money, loaning private homeowners money, assuming that land values would grow enough for these actors to pay them back. And when the crash happens, the actors can't pay the banks back, and the banks go into, collapse, and it's a fiscal crisis all over again. And so, in this moment, many critics of that earlier growth strategy argued that cities should develop to meet the needs of their existing population and not just anticipate endless growth. And partly that was by putting on certain growth controls. And you had figures like Rexford Tugwell saying, going into city planning and saying that New York should devote its money towards public services rather than just, roads to nowhere, basically. But you also had people making economic arguments for public housing by saying that rather than build more redundant, luxury housing, by building public housing, we can meet the demand of citizens. We can pay back public housing bonds through the rents of people in public housing. And we could make sure that banks get some of their money back by them investing in this public housing and knowing that they'll get some kind of return. So public housing is this, development strategy, and it's able to pass in these cities in this brief window when the private real estate sector is basically dead. So this kind of fiscal argument sort of slips in at a crucial moment. But by the late 1930s, again, there's a lot of pushback against this model. For many American liberals, they again don't want the public housing competing against the private sector in terms of housing middle income people or even upper working class people. And public housing becomes reserved only for the very poorest Americans. And they're not able to pay back their own rent, pay back their own debt through the sort of lower rents that they're charging for those folks. So public housing, rather than a money gaining operation, becomes a sort of a subsidy, basically. And instead, you see the city and the government putting its money behind suburbanization, urban renewal, and other strategies that focus on the private sector as the main actor for economic development.
And then bring us up to the 1970s and beyond.
Sure. So after World War II, there were different groups in the city, like the Regional Plan Association, who realized that real estate alone, or even building infrastructure alone, wasn't enough for the city to remain solvent. It needed to attract industries and businesses to it. And so after World War II, there's a much more fine-grained attention to what kind of industries the city should attract. And the assumption for many policymakers was, let's attract the most profitable, largest enterprises to our city. Many banks and corporations were fine with that. And so you get this corporate attraction and retainment strategy that really dominates the city after World War II. And there were some critics of this, like Jane Jacobs, who argued that a more diverse economy was needed that included small and large enterprises. And you also had many Black nationalists arguing that communities like Harlem and Bed-Stuy were losing out by only attracting white corporations to a city, and that by promoting local Black businesses, you could increase their development and also increase their political power. So you got these two critiques, but ultimately the city is able to combine its white collar strategy with certain trade-offs to these groups. People who want historic preservation get preservation plus urban, renewal in other parts of the city. Um, you don't get this alternative paradigm of economic development based around its neighborhoods. Now, by the 1970s, it's clear to some critics that this sort of corporate attraction strategy hadn't worked, that these corporations were demanding a lot of subsidies, that they were actually, by raising land values, increasing costs for the city by making it harder for people to afford housing and putting more, it was creating poverty in a sense, and that was draining the city's welfare budget. So it was raising its welfare budget. So you got this range of criticisms of this corporate attraction model, but there wasn't really a lot of alternatives in its place. Partly this is because the assault on New York's welfare state after the fiscal crisis was so direct and brutal that most people were just defensive of it rather than trying to promote something new. But it's also because the welfare state was so much more visible as a seeming object of fiscal decline, because the welfare state appears on the city's budget. The welfare state is racialized and associated with Black and brown people. And many white working class people assume that the growing welfare state is the cause of the city's fiscal crisis. Um, Left out of this is the more invisible economic strategies of corporate attraction and retainment. Those strategies don't appear on the budget necessarily. They're lodged in these, unaccountable bureaucracies. But for many critics of the welfare state, they were fine with that. And so after the 70s, the city basically continues its corporate attraction and retainment strategy, but just without the welfare state. And for many historians, they then view that shift in the 70s as a paradigm change between redistribution and from redistribution to economic growth as the city's sort of priority. But from my perspective, what we're seeing after the 70s isn't the domination of economic logic, but the impoverishment of economic logic. Because in earlier fiscal crises, you saw all these different experiments to rethink the city's economy. But after the 70s, there's not as much of that. So the whole story is really this kind of gradual narrowing.
And then policymakers are left with fewer tools to use to respond to future conditions.
Yeah, no, I think we get these debates over, should we tax the rich or not? P.S., I think we should. But it's all assuming that we need to rely on the wealthy in order to grow our economies. And there's less focus on worker cooperatives or nonprofit enterprises or all these other experiments that had been proposed in the 1930s. There's less of a constituency for them as well. So I think there's this kind of impoverishment of what I call the fiscal imagination after the 70s. And yeah, I think that only now are we kind of getting back to opening our imagination again.
Hmm. Now, not too long ago, you had a Hagley Galambos National Fellowship, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how that helped or what impact it had on your professional development.
Yeah, well, I think first of all, just being there was an incredibly enriching experience. I mean, I was able to meet with scholars coming and going. I was able to order through the interlibrary loan various books and manuscripts from other collections. I was able to deliver sort of an early version of the book in a sort of address to various scholars. And no, I think just being able to have the time to reflect on the work and put together my sources in an atmosphere that was, you know, very serious, but also just, if in there, just incredibly refreshing and, beautiful, I think gave me helped the book in a way that it wouldn't have been if I was just in my little, brown apartment, in some corner nook. So I think that it helped the book. It helped the scholarship. I think it also um, just the process of applying for it and thinking through my project and what its main arguments and contributions were, all of that um, propelled the project in a way that it wouldn't have been if I had just been left to my own devices. Uh, so, it was enormously helpful for me.
Well, that's terrific. Now, I wonder whether your project has some implications for the present day or perhaps even the near-term future.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of discussion now about economic alternatives between Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson talking about abundance, people in the kind of YIMBY versus NIMBY crowd, and then with Zoran Mamdani running for mayor in New York, there's a lot of discussions on how cities should develop. And for me, the key is that it's not enough to rely on the wealthy for growing our economies. That if you're relying on extractive and speculative enterprises, it's going to pose a risk to cities. But at the same time, cities do have a lot of power because they spend so much on economic development strategies. And so that funding and expertise could be redirected towards alternative development strategies. And certainly in New York, there have been many campaigns for that, as my book shows, but even more recently, there's quite a few cities out there like Preston, England, Cleveland in the US, that are experimenting with these different strategies. I'll just add that not only policy-wise are there these models, but as politicians are trying to develop a constituency for progressive reforms, I think they really need to deliver the goods. And by delivering these kind of alternative development policies, it provides an economic base for more progressive policies that they can then build out and use to support their campaigns. And I think, these as they say, policies shape politics. So by promoting these alternative strategies, we can reshape some of the political coalitions that are possible, I think, in our cities.
Well, Daniel, what an interesting and important point, and thank you for sharing your work with us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I'm great to speak with you, Greg.
Likewise. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts and more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's Hagley.org. Don't be a stranger.